Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to share Polar Pals Under the Northern Lights. I'm using this Polar Pals stamp set with some adorable images as well as sentiments. The first thing I do anytime I use a clear stamp is I use a white eraser on top of the stamping surface, removes any possible manufacturing residue, and then I take a soft brush and brush that away. I'm going to set that to the side for just a moment. The piece that I want my finished piece to be on is going to be 4 inches by 5¼ inches. So I trim that down because I want to have it on the finished side. For right now, I'm using the Let It Snow stamp or sentiment from this set, and I'm heat embossing it onto a piece of hammermill cardstock. Now, I heat emboss it with some silver embossing powder. If you want it to stand out a little bit more, you could use white embossing powder and it would coordinate well with the rest of the card. I chose to do it a little bit more subtle. You could still see that sentiment, but it does blend a little bit into the background once I'm done. So just know that if you want it to stand out just a little bit more, using white embossing powder is absolutely perfect here and would be a good substitution. So I want to create my background before coloring in my images because I'm going to need to wait for this to dry for a few moments. So I'm going to be using 2 different distress colors to start with. I'm using some Chip Sapphire as well as some Black Soot. I'm going to do a little light coat of that Chip Sapphire over my background, concentrating mostly around the edges. I always like it when I'm doing an ink black background to do it heavier around the edges. I think it frames it in just a little bit, and I really like the look of it. So originally I was going to leave that center spot white, but I do go back in with that Chip Sapphire and blend it in a little bit more. I'm using some large Spellbinders blending brushes. I really like these for backgrounds, but you can use whatever blending brushes are your favorite. Those will work as well. So I did a little bit of that black around the outside edges just to darken that a little bit, frame it in just a little bit more. And then I went back in with that Chip Sapphire. Now, before we do the next step, I need to clean up all of that black and Chip Sapphire ink off my sticky mat because I'm going to be using some interference inks to create the Northern Lights. Now, I love interference inks. I use them often. They've got some beautiful, bright, bold colors, but when you tilt them into the light, they have a interference color to them. So this one here is pink champagne, and if I tilt it into the light, I get a green interference to it. And you can see those colors on the pads or on the lids of the pads. If I were to use this ink pad on black or dark cardstock, you'd see the green and not the pink. So it's really fun. It's like 2 ink pads in one, and I just love the shimmer that it gives. Now, you could do this same technique with just regular distress inks. The only difference is you wouldn't get that shimmer to it, but you'd get a beautiful Northern Lights look. If you want that shimmer, you could always use, say, a shimmer paint or a shimmer spray over top of your background to bring that in. The next color I'm using is Summer Garden. This one is a beautiful bright green. When you tilt in the light, you get a little bit of a blue shimmer to it. And the last one I'm going to be using is Lavender Fields. So we're going to see the beautiful purple, but when you tilt Lavender Fields into the light, you get a little bit of a green shimmer. So those shimmer colors also blend perfectly and coordinate perfectly with the colors that I want for my Northern Lights. Now, just like the distress inks, these interference inks are water reactive as well. So this background right here doesn't look fantastic, but I'm taking my Mighty Mister and I'm just doing a light misting of water over top of it. And it just starts to blend those inks together a little bit. It makes them just a little bit more subtle and blend into the background. So because I misted that, I need to take it off of my mat carefully so it can dry from both the top and the bottom. And I'm going to set that aside to dry while I'm coloring in my images. So I chose the image with the polar bear as well as the seal. I'm stamping it onto some hammermill cardstock and I'm stamping it with some black Memento ink. I want to color these images with some Copics. I'm going to do some very, very simple Copic coloring here. You could also, if you wanted to, stamp it onto watercolor paper and do watercoloring, but you would have to wait for that to dry as well. Copics are going to be a little bit quicker and I don't have to wait quite so long for them to dry or set. So the first color I'm using here is C1. It's the cool gray. I'm using all cool grays for this. I have 4 different markers here. I just had them frozen on the screen. So I want my coloring to be really, really simple and really neutral. I want to still see that bright white cardstock through the coloring. So for that C1 for the polar bear, I only do the shading areas. I actually don't even blend it in. I just do his legs or his lower areas, shade them a little bit. Then for the seal, I'm using C3, C5, and C7. So I start with that C3, color him totally. Really, you could just use 2 colors for this. I had just decided that I wanted to use the 4 colors, but you could easily just blend that seal with 2 colors because he's so tiny. Then I go in with that C5, doing some of the shading, deepen some of that shading with the C7, then go back in with the C5 to blend the 5 and 7 together, and then go back and do the whole thing with the C3 so that the seal is nice and gray with some shading, and then the polar bear is still white with just a little bit of light gray shading. That C1 is one of the colors that I often use when I'm coloring with Copics. I will often do just a little bit of a line around them, and usually it's with that C1. It's one of those colors that you really don't see, but it almost looks like a little bit of a shadow to the eye. It makes that image pop out a little bit, but it's something that you don't see until it's pointed out to you. So it's one that I love to use for that. So it's really, really light in color. So it's perfect for shading that polar bear. It would also be perfect for, say, shading a snowman because there's very little color to it. So I'm using my detail scissors to color or to cut out these images. Unfortunately, there's no dies to them, so we're going to need to do just a little bit of fussy cutting, but the shapes of them are fairly simple anyways. So when I'm doing my fussy cutting, I like to turn my paper and not my scissors. So you'll see my scissors pretty much have the same position through the whole thing. I might change them just a tiny little bit back and forth, but for the most part, it's the paper that turns and moves and not my scissors. So once I have this cut and ready to go, I can set that aside. Now I need something for the seal and the polar bear to sit on. So I want a little bit of snowy ice. So I'm taking a bit of that hammermill cardstock, cutting it a little bit narrower to the 4 inches. That's the same width as my background. And then I cut a strip that was about 1.5 inches wide. I'm going to use just a tiny little bit of that chipped sapphire on the lower edges just to give it a little bit of shadow, a little bit of a frame to continue the frame on my Northern Lights. And then I am moving it just a little bit up on my sticky mat. I have this natural pearl ink pad. It doesn't have a lot of color to it when you're using it on light colors. You can see a little bit of a white haze on my mat, and you'll see that if you're using it on dark colors. But what it does is it gives it a beautiful shimmer that the video doesn't show at all, but it looks perfect for snow and ice. So it also has that shimmer that kind of echoes the shimmer in the sky. Now, when I'm using interference inks, I often like to use one of those pads to the mat for my card. So I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5.25 inches. And I just realized that I said the measurements for my background here wrong. This was 3.75 inches by 5 inches. To add just a little bit of snow to my background, I'm using some sparkle splatter accents. Now, this is like a nail polish bottle with a nail polish brush. When I'm taking that out of the bottle after shaking it well, I take the brush and run it on the inside of the bottle just to take some of the excess off. And then you just tap that brush to flick it to get that splatter on it. It's so easy to use and very little mess. Then I can start to assemble my cards. The great thing about that sparkle splatter accents as well is it dries really, really quickly, so you don't have to wait for that to dry. I glue my mat onto my A2 card base, and now we're ready to glue down my Northern Lights background. Now, because I used hammermill cardstock with water and it's not really a big fan of water, I only did a light mist on it, but it still likes to curve that paper. So you may need to flatten it out a little bit before gluing it down. I'm gluing everything down with some Barely Art glue. It's my favorite glue to use for things because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And then once it's stuck and once it's set, it is good to go, and there's nothing going to fall apart. I've never had a card fall apart with it. So it's a great glue to use. And I use it for probably 95% of my projects. So after adding the polar bear and the seal, my card is pretty much together. And you could leave it like this, but even with that bit of shimmer on the background, I wanted to add just a touch more. So I'm using a little bit of stickles to add just a bit of sparkle right around where the polar bear is standing, as well as where the seal is laying and the horizon. It's just going to add a little bit of sparkle. It's not going to add any color. And then I use some glossy accents for the noses to give them some gloss and dimension. I let that dry for probably about a half an hour. And then our card is finished. And by having that polar bear colored really, really lightly, it really pops off of that Northern Lights background. And then the seal being colored a little bit darker, it pops off of the snowy background. The shimmer on the sky as well as the snow is subtle, but it's absolutely gorgeous, and it really is a great background for that bear and the seal. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fantastic day.